Welcome into Four More Pages. I am joined by Dr. Tim Bowman today, and you are the author of You Will Never Be One of Us, A Teacher, a Texas Town, and the Rural Roots of Radical Conservatism. You released this book years ago now, and so what was your thought process of, bringing this story to life of someone who moved to Hereford and then, just kind of had to adapt to the culture that is this area?
So that's a good question. It was Wayne himself who, he's still living. He lives in Timber Creek Canyon, which is down between Canyon and Amarillo, who reached out to me about the book or about writing his story. And I was just attracted to the idea in part because I wanted to understand the drama that he experienced in Hereford and why people treated him the way that they did, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and part of the book, it's like you talk about how, his journey of teaching. And so, what did you learn about his journey, and what can readers expect when they open this book?
So Wayne in 1975, he was a 30-year-old guy from Amarillo, and he got a job teaching at Hereford High School. He taught way out in California in Death Valley before that, but he was from Amarillo and wanted to come back here. And in the middle of the 70s, he made the fateful decision to start a chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union in Hereford, which ruffled a lot of feathers in Hereford. And I really couldn't understand why a seemingly, innocuous guy who just wanted to do good to, who doesn't, love championing civil liberties, right? I mean, those are something that we all cherish, whatever our political points of view might be. But how people in a little sort of isolated town could find something like that so objectionable. And so what I learned about in writing the book was the relationship, not just that a young teacher could have with people in an isolated town in the Texas Panhandle or on the Southern Plains, but what in the 1970s the liberal conservative divide in this country was really like. And one of the suggestions that I make toward the end of the book is that the current problems that we have in the United States today, where liberals and conservatives hate and distrust each other and essentially want to stamp each other out, really has its origins in the 1970s. And I was concerned with. I really, Wayne is someone who I could relate to. He was idealistic and, interested in society and politics. And, as a historian, I'm really interested in, the downtrodden, for lack of a better term, regular people who've been mistreated by the powers that be. And Wayne was the same way and is the same way still to this day. And I just didn't understand how someone who came from his political perspective, and like I was saying, he's from here, so it's not like he was a transplant, how someone who came from his political perspective could be so thoroughly rejected, and why otherwise quiet, good, church-going, community-oriented people could find him a threat. And I didn't think it was just meanness, or the rejection of an individual who was different. So in the book, the book is my way of trying to figure out what the threat was, why people were so scared of this young, idealistic guy. So that's really it. It's a lot about the relationship between teachers and the public in a small town, and how certain kind of dramas can unfold, and kind of what we can learn from them. I call the book, or actually other people have called the book, something that's known as microhistory, which is where you take a bunch of big ideas and you confine them into a small space, and you try to extract a kind of a broad meaning on a little story. This book is basically about 2 years. It takes place from 1975 to 1977 primarily. There's some context and background and stuff, but that's basically it. I think that there's a lot that we can learn about modern America by looking at the history of education and teachers, and what teachers and students and people in communities experience and go through.
And so in the book, after he's fired for creating this chapter here in Hereford,
Mm-hmm.
he sues.
Mm-hmm.
And at first he wins, but then after, it goes a little bit further, there's an appeal by the school district, and then ultimately he settles and decides to step away from teaching. And so, in your experience and getting to talk to him about his experience, what was that takeaway and that decision to say, I'm not going to go back to teaching, I'm going to take a different path?
Well, he was blacklisted
Mm.
from a lot of regional schools. I think he told me when I interviewed him and a handful of other people for the book, there were some people who didn't want to talk to me because the old wounds
Mm.
can fester for a long time. Um, he was really hurt by it. As someone who's a teacher myself, I mean, you really. I think when you're a teacher and you take your job really seriously, you really develop a heart for your students, and you want to see them succeed and do well in life. And I teach college, and that's true for me. And so he was an eighth grade teacher when he was teaching, and so these were young kids. And I think that losing the ability to teach really hurt him. It's a pain that he never got over, and I serve in an administrative role in the history department at WT. So I teach, but I also head the department and I evaluate my colleagues. And I've seen reports on his teaching and feedback that he got from his students. And I can say beyond any shadow of a doubt, in my experience as an administrator and as a historian, he was a gifted teacher. He really connected with people. And I think Wayne's nurturing side really lived on past his teaching career, because after he was effectively kicked out of the teaching profession, he went back to school and became a nurse practitioner. So, he continued to care for people, and who can't respect that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, you talked about how there's several kind of different factors that go into this book, and talking about the history of, how differing views can kind of cause a lot of hurt moving forward for people. And so sometimes those tensions, they're still there in present day. And so as a historian of, seeing that this happened, back in the 70s and continues to happen in some places now, I guess, what's a takeaway that you've gotten as, time has progressed and you kind of see those same kind of divisions between political parties and when it comes to certain beliefs?
It's a great question. I think the most important takeaway that I have in studying Wayne's story is that people, and I say this in the conclusion of the book, it's almost as if his detractors who believed the ACLU was a legitimate threat, that it was going to bring labor unrest and the tumult of the civil rights period and all of that into this isolated town. And people who were on the other side, who were more aligned with what we might call the 60s generation, even though this was in 1975, I think that they were effectively, like, if this makes sense, kind of speaking different languages. So in other words, the people in Hereford looked at this young guy as a threat, and he looked at them, the people who were mistreating him, as bad or hypocritical or immoral. And what I want to suggest, and some people might quibble with me for this, but what I want to suggest is that both were wrong in a sense, and that there was a tragic fallout from this fight over the ACLU, and that a town lost a gifted English teacher. And so I think the main takeaway with the divide in the country now, that I see at least, is that people on each side of a divide are never going to get anywhere if they want to stamp each other out constantly. This what we see in our society, and not to both sides of the issue, but I think that this is really true. If you look on social media, each side wants to effectively silence the other and push them out and say, your views don't matter, you don't count. And I really believe that the only way forward through our current political problems is through unity and understanding that the people you disagree with, it's totally fine that you disagree with them. but they're not bad for thinking the way that they do. And that may be kind of naive and hopelessly idealistic, but I think that it's true. You know, um, the more people look at the other side as being bad for having certain beliefs and not recognizing that we're all Americans and that we all need to come together to make this country work, we're never going to get anywhere.
And so for you, when you were kind of hearing his story, were you shocked at how much pushback he got from the community, knowing that, you know, he is from Amarillo? He's not from Hereford, but he's from Amarillo. He's from the area. And so you would think that it's, you know, still a relatively rural part of the world. And so, you know, maybe people sticking together. And so were you surprised at the pushback that he got?
In a way, yes, and in a way, no. I know that the ACLU as an organization has its origins in a time period we call the Progressive Era, which is the early 20th century U.S. And it at its founding was very liberal, for lack of a better term. You know, if the terms liberal and conservative make sense in the 19 teens. And it was associated with left-leaning ideas and ideology, and so. In some ways, its presence coming into a long-standing conservative place, it had a politically unified or homogenous culture isn't all that surprising. But in a way, it did surprise me. I mean, the ACLU at its core was founded to protect American civil liberties, and I mean, I think we're mistaken in this country and thinking that our civil liberties are always sacrosanct. And so when you've got an organization, they can be infringed upon. And I think when you've got an organization that that is dedicated to protecting the individual rights that you and I enjoy, that is a good thing, and that can be nurtured. So, yeah, yes and no, I'd say.
Was this book, obviously when you bring up the past, sometimes it opens, old wounds, and sometimes it can be kind of healing to talk about it. And so from talking to Wayne and from talking to the people who you interviewed for this book, was it more of a healing process, or was it more of something that kind of just opened up old wounds and kind of left kind of a bad taste in their mouth once again?
That's another great question. I think that it was healing for some people. I hope it was healing for Wayne. This is a story that he wanted to see written while he's still here.
Right.
He's an older guy, and so I think that knowing that people could learn from his story was a very good thing for him. There is. I only have a couple of instances. So there were former students and school administrators and teachers from Hereford who agreed to talk to me, and there were some people who didn't want to talk to me because it still felt fresh to them, even though this was, 40, 50 years ago now. There's one individual who I probably shouldn't name here, but this is a person who was one of Wayne's detractors in Hereford.
Okay.
And I never found him, unfortunately. I didn't even know this guy was still alive. And I was walking around one day, and I got a little ping. It was a Facebook message notification. This is going to be the most Uber 2020 story ever. And I looked down on it, and at first I didn't recognize the name, and then I realized that is a guy that is in my book. Holy cow. So I clicked on the message, and he said something to the effect of, I read your book. I don't necessarily agree with the ways that I was portrayed in the book, but I was a young man in the 70s, and I realized I was wrong for some of the things that I said about Wayne and some of the ways that I treated him, so I would like to reach out to him and apologize. And I was floored by that. I mean, as a modern historian, having a person, one of the gratifying things to me about the work that I do is I get to write about people who were either recently living or still alive. Knowing that was something that could happen because of the work that I did made me feel really, really good. So I can't remember if I called Wayne or I texted him and I said, hey, so-and-so wants to reach out to you. Is that okay? He said, sure. And the guy did, and they had some kind of a conversation and, mended their fences, so to speak. So, Yeah, I think that I don't know if that fully answers your question, but
Yeah.
I think that even though this is a piece of historical scholarship, technically, I really like that it had a deeper meaning and was able to provide some sort of emotional uplift or support to this one individual. So yeah.
And when I've talked to other professors from WTI, like to ask them, is this book something that's a part of, your teaching curriculum?
Hmm.
And if so, how do you incorporate it and kind of what's the reaction from students if you do incorporate this into class?
I don't incorporate it,
Okay.
and I think there are differing views on this
Mm-hmm.
at WT and in the academy, and definitely in my discipline, which is history.
Mm-hmm.
I don't incorporate it for a number of reasons. Number one, I just don't feel comfortable doing it. Part of this is just kind of like a personal proclivity. I'm not the best at talking about my own stuff. And then if I brought it into a class, I'd have a bunch of students who would probably. One of the things that I always want my students is to be honest when we're reading books or scholarship,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I want them to be able to say, well, I love this for this reason, and I hated this for this reason.
Yeah.
Well, if I'm the guy who's,
Yeah.
controlling their grades, they can't, if they didn't like the book or something, they wouldn't feel comfortable being honest. And
Mm-hmm.
so I have it's like an ethical gray area for me,
Okay.
if that makes sense. But I think that there was a part in, I learn a lot as a teacher from hearing about what my colleagues are doing and seeing what they're doing in the
Mm-hmm.
classroom, right? And I think there was a lot of doing the book for me that reaffirmed what, like we were talking about earlier, what good teaching
Yeah.
is and how a teacher can be um, empathetic with their students, which he clearly was, that I find inspiring. So, um, yeah, kind of a roundabout way of bringing the book in. But I guess what I'm saying is Wayne is a guy who inspires me personally, and
Mm-hmm.
that is something that. And again, that's solely bad. Doesn't have anything to do with politics. That's solely based on his ability to
Yeah.
establish a rapport with his students.
Mm-hmm.
I find that really quite remarkable. And yeah.
I want to talk about the title of the book
Uh-huh.
because it makes you stop and think about, okay, like what is this book about? Because you will never be one of us. A teacher, a Texas town, and the rural roots of radical conservatism. How did you decide on this title?
That's a good question. So the main part of the title, that "You Will Never Be One of Us," is basically a play on several things that people said to him. That he
Mm-hmm.
didn't belong. There were people that told him that he would fit in better with California, out in California again, or New York or something. Because of his political views. So. And he really felt alone in the town. He had a couple of friends
Mm-hmm.
in town, obviously, but not a lot. One of his closest friends was a Catholic priest who had an activist kind of bent that he really wanted to advocate for Mexican and Mexican American farm workers in
Mm-hmm.
the community, some of whom came to the school. But he didn't have a lot of friends, so there was very much this insider kind of outsider ethic
Yeah.
in the story, right? And so that was where the title, really came from. This whole idea of you not belonging and you
Mm-hmm.
not, we're not going to accept you. There were certain ways he was told that he needed to change to be accepted. His principal at one point told him he had long hair, which in 1975 I think meant it came down past his ears. I'm not making that up. I mean, it's
Yeah.
true. And so that was that. The subtitle, in fact, is not something that I came up with. That was a
Okay.
marketing decision by the press.
Okay.
I don't remember what it was. It was originally like the culture wars in a Texas Panhandle town, but the marketing team at the University of Oklahoma Press wanted something about radicalism in politics,
Okay.
basically, so the book would have more
Yeah.
attention caught, right? Like you were
Yeah.
just saying. So yeah.
Interesting. And so, in talking, you mentioned, that there were some students there who they were there when this was happening, and,
Mhm.
they were his students. And so, when I think back to kind of the teachers that I had, like that taught history and government and things of like that nature,
Uh-huh.
the teachers that stand out are the ones who, like, they did really show both sides, and they introduced us to different things. And
Yeah,
so from his students and from your experience as a historian, as someone who's always learning, what value do you see of, introducing your students to things that maybe they're not learning about or aren't familiar with at home on a daily basis?
Oh gosh, incredible value. I mean, that's ultimately what it's all about. I'm ethically obligated to keep my personal views out of the classroom as much as I can because, you know, studying history, studying history is about becoming a better person, and no matter what your political or social or religious views are. And I think it's important for students and readers, to get as many perspectives as they can on life or on the past. And that's really critical. I think when teachers are boxed in or when, I don't think you see this as often as a lot of people think you do, but when a teacher has a specific sort of political agenda, that's a terrible thing. I mean, as a teacher, one is obligated to meet your students where they are and to encourage them and to simply, and I say this as a history teacher, to say, here's a bunch of things that are really important about American history, Texas history, modern history, whatever. And if you think about these things, you just think about them, right? Then you will become a more thoughtful, deliberative human being and a better American too, right? If you're more informed, sort of getting back to our earlier conversation that this will help, heal hopefully the current problems that we have. So critically important, really, really important.
All right, and this series is called Four More Pages. So I have four questions for you to kind of end things.
Okay.
What is the biggest thing that you learned in writing this book and researching with Wayne? What is the one thing, if you had to pick one thing for readers to take away from it, what would it be?
Okay.
What is your hope that this book, that the impact of this book will have on readers and society as a whole, seeing the current, political climate and seeing things that maybe have changed and things that are repeating itself when it comes to classrooms and teachers? And number four, what was the most fun part of writing this book?
Okay, hopefully I can remember all those. Let me try. Okay, so I think to answer the first question, which was about what was the most interesting or surprising thing to me, right? The most interesting or surprising thing to me, I would say, is that I felt like I understood, and this might sound a little weird, but I understood why the people who effectively ran Wayne out of town did what they did. And again, it wasn't because they were evil or mean-spirited or anything like that. They really thought that if he came and started the American Civil Liberties Union, and I think one of the key words is union, right? Texas is a state where labor unionism isn't super popular. I mean, there are labor unions in Texas, right?
Yeah.
But Texas is a right-to-work state, which means that the legal status of unionism isn't as firmly affixed in other states like in the East or the North or whatever, or California, I guess. I understood why they found him threatening. He really, to them, they were watching what was going on in the 60s and 70s on the news, and they really thought that here in 1975, their orderly, quiet town was going to be infiltrated by rabble-rousers. Now, that doesn't mean he was a rabble-rouser, because he really wasn't. He was just a naive kid at the time, really. But they thought he was going to bring in labor activism and farm labor activism, and that it would upend the town socially and economically. And I totally get why that freaked people out. I really do understand it. And so that was what I set out to do in writing the book, was not to understand Wayne better, but to understand these people better who did this to him. And I really feel like that was a successful thing.
Yep.
And so I'm sorry, you'll have to remind me what questions 2 and 3 and 4
2
were.
is what do you hope people who read the book will take away from it?
Right. Okay, so what I hope people will take away from it is that we're not really all that different. And that, if we, again, I keep coming back to this idea that maybe I'm being overly idealistic or naive, or, maybe I'm just generally that way as a person. But that um, we can easily, if we just stop for a little bit and let cooler heads prevail in any kind of a political debate or social debate or whatever, we can come to a better understanding of the people we disagree with. And, I think social media has certainly over the course of my adult life made those problems worse and not better. So I think that's a really important thing.
Perfect. And what impact do you hope the book has on society as a whole?
Right. The same kind of thing. I just, I'm not under any illusion that a history book with the university press is going to be like some kind of runaway bestseller or whatever. But I hope that it shows people that divides can be bridged. Yeah. And
Number 4 was what was the most exciting thing about writing this book?
Most exciting thing. Yeah, I love that question too. The most exciting thing to me about writing any book or any article or whatever it is in history is getting the germ of an idea in my head. And, there's a certain amount of kind of OCD that takes over for me. Like I get an idea and I'm like, man, that's a really good idea. How would I do that? And then I start kind of planning or mapping things out, and things just kind of start to snowball and work out. And then there's this excitement that takes over. It's just like, wow, this is going to really happen. And as a writer, it is an incredibly gratifying thing to have an idea, like just an idea someday, and then to actually be able to hold the finished product in your hand. It takes a long time. This isn't that long of a book, and it took me 6 years to write it, I think. And that's honestly kind of quick for a history book, but that's the most gratifying thing, is knowing that you can capture a story that's important and dramatic and that people can learn from, and you can take it as an idea and turn it into something tangible that will then live on past you. I think that's a cool thing.
Well, Dr. Bowman, I appreciate you for joining me today. This was, when Chip told me about this book, I was like, this is interesting because it happened right here in this area. And it's like, unless you're from the area or you grew up in one of these areas, your family did, so you probably don't know that something like this happened so close to Amarillo and right in Hereford if you're from Hereford. So it was really interesting. So I'm glad that, you were able to come in and share about this book.
Thank you, Maya. I really appreciate it. This was really fun. Great to be here.
Perfect. Well, that's all we have for this episode of 4 More Pages. We'll see you on the next one.